Okay, so hello everybody. So good to see you and have like a minute to chat as you all tuned into the meeting. Marianne, did you want to say anything before I start?
I would just like to say that this is the fifth and final in the series of eyes. I think it's been a success. It's generated a lot of interest, and I think going forward, we're going to do some more work on reimagining God, and we don't know exactly when that's going to be, but stay tuned. That's what I say. And how pleased we are to have you this morning, Diane, who's going to lead us in a discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm excited about what you're talking about doing going forward too. Fantastic news. So I think I know pretty much everybody, but just in case, I'm Diane Buchanan. Rick and I have been members of the church for 8 years now. We chair the stewardship committee, and we've done so for, I think that we've lost track. It's our 4th or 5th year this year to chair stewardship. Have an awesome committee there. Reproductive rights, including, of course, abortion, has been a lifelong passion of mine as an adult. My mother was such a wonderful example for me as a junior high and high school kid because she volunteered at Planned Parenthood and was an escort. She put her money where her mouth is, so to speak, and was a mentor to me in that respect. I was on the board of Planned Parenthood of Greater Texas for 6 years in Dallas, and also chaired the Breakfast of Champions in Santa Fe. Some of you have probably been to that event over the years, usually in January. I co-chaired that with a friend for 5 years. I hope we'll be able to get back to that. If anybody's interested, they are going to do a virtual Breakfast of Champions this year. If you go to the Planned Parenthood of the Rocky Mountains website, I think you can find information there. And, I was glad to see they were going to do it. So today we're going to talk about Dr. Willie Parker and his book, Life's Work, which I know Cece said he read it. Maybe some of you others did, but I'm going to go through it kind of as a chronology of his life. I do recommend it if you have any interest in this subject, and you must because you're here today. It's a really wonderful read. So he's a hero for me, as are all doctors and nurses, healthcare workers, clinic owners who provide abortion care that women are legally entitled to in this country. They work in a challenging and often frightening environment. Before Willie Parker came to Santa Fe as a keynote speaker, I think it was in 2018 when he was our keynote speaker. I had already, read a lot about his work and heard his name in the reproductive justice movement in this country. His story is a little unique because not only does he do abortion care, he has become taken it upon himself to become a outspoken about the issue. He's not doing it quietly. Let's put it that way. He's put his life on the line in so many ways. And that's not an exaggeration to say that either. Many people who work in this line of healthcare do so quietly, in the shadows, and I don't mean because they're ashamed of what they're doing. They fear for their safety. You all have heard about clinic attacks, murders of abortion providers and nurses and caregivers in abortion clinics. So when this book came out, Life's Work, in 2016, I bought it. I actually ordered it before it was even out and read it right away. And then I read it a second time for a book club that I'm in, where I presented on this book. And now I've read it a third time for this class. And every time I've read it, I've pulled out a little something new, something I didn't really notice before. I do have to say, and I talked to Marianne about this earlier last week, as I was doing my final research for today. I thought, I've never Googled Willie Parker. I'm going to do it and just see what comes up. And of course, there was tons of information there. including a very upsetting headline about him having been accused of sexual assault. And it took my breath away. I just couldn't believe it. A man that I hold in such high esteem for so long, and so many do. So I had to calm myself down, walk a few laps around the house, and then I started really digging into this issue and read for a couple of hours every thing I could find about what happened. And as it turns out, he did have consensual sex with a woman in a hotel room at a conference in Dallas. The woman decided many months later that it wasn't consensual because she was intoxicated at the time. Willie Parker was not intoxicated because he does not drink alcohol. It's very much a he said, she said situation. But what happened to Willie Parker as a result of it was he was canceled from the reproductive justice movement in this country. He resigned from boards he was on. He was uninvited. He was on the speaking network all the time, like he did for us in Santa Fe. He was uninvited to all these events. And people who knew him and loved him and worked with him for many years made immediate statements against him when that happened. So I am a very strong believer in the voices of women, in the fact that we in this country have a history of silencing women throughout history and rushing to defend men, especially when men are charismatic and widely admired by a lot of people. Women haven't always received, or even often received, the respect and justice due them. And I'm happy that we've had a reckoning in our country with the Me Too movement. It was past time for that. I'm sure you agree. But I also believe, after all this reading that I did about this, that Willie Parker was denied justice in this case. He was condemned in a rush to judgment by society, and he didn't get without due process. I think he deserved at least that. I feel like I can kind of hold, as I think about it as a feminist and a supporter of women, I feel like, but also with men in my life whom I dearly love, my dad and my brothers, my husband, my son, I feel like I can hold these two things in my heart: justice for women and compassion for women, and also fairness for men. And I feel like I read enough to know that the woman who accused him, the story doesn't quite add up. And she told some untruths. She told a few little untruths. It just doesn't add up. So I called Marianne and said, what should I do? And we decided I should do the class. So I'm doing the class, but I wanted you all to know about what happened. So the first thing I thought we should do, and I hope bear with me because I'm going to try to screen share, is look at a quick history before we talk about Willie Parker specifically, a quick history of abortion in the United States. So bear with me for 1 second here. Okay, there it is. Now let me, so here's a brief history, and it's brief, but I didn't want to spend a ton of time on this. That abortion is as old as antiquity. For as long as women have been getting pregnant, women have been trying to figure out how not to be pregnant. Historically, before quickening, before the fetus moves, no one believed that a human life actually existed, not even the Catholic Church. And pretty much all religions felt that abortion was permissible until the fetus moved. So for our first century of this country, abortion was legal in every state. But in the 19th century, US states began to banning it. And that movement was led by a lot of doctors who were feeling pressure. They wanted more business. And the midwives, women, were the traditional purveyors of birth, pregnancy. They did all that. Women did that. But then when male doctors started to grow in number, they wanted to take control of that. The southern part of our country, the western part of our country was being colonized at the time. And one prominent anti-abortion campaigner at that time said, will our frontiers be, oops, sorry, populated by our own children or by those of aliens? Really wanting women, white women, to have a lot of babies. The second half of the 1800s, the states began passing laws banning abortions in all cases, except for therapeutic reasons. And then of course, people with money, wealthy women were able to talk their doctors into the therapeutic reason they needed to end their pregnancy. Poor women could not do that. By 1900, abortion was illegal everywhere in the US, except in order to save the life of the mother. So other countries had more liberal attitudes toward it, and so wealthy women, again, could travel to Mexico or England or Sweden or even Asia to terminate their pregnancies if they needed to do that. Organizations began forming even then to help women to fight for abortion rights, as you can see from the form. So the move to repeal these abortion bans really was driven by doctors who were treating women for injuries and seeing serious injuries and deaths related to self-induced abortion or botched abortions by people who really didn't know what they were doing. And it wasn't, till the 1960s when women began to really call out loud and fight for easy access to not just abortion, but contraception. Women couldn't even get contraception at that time, but they were beginning to think about life outside of motherhood and home to the workforce. And they wanted to be able to control when they were having children. So we all know that Roe v. Wade, the Supreme Court handed down Roe v. Wade in 1973, which virtually wiped out all those bans from the 19th century. And at the time, a majority of Americans did support the decision. Although we all know that ever since then, there's been a huge, huge battle, and especially beginning really hard in the 1980s, when evangelicals got involved and claimed the moral high ground and coined the term pro-life and called fetuses babies from the very beginning, said that life began at conception, which is not scientifically true, and claiming scripture to be on their side of the issue. In the decades since, of course, we've all witnessed the chipping away of states, chipping away at abortion rights. Still legal in this country, but many states have made it so difficult for women to access abortion care now. They have these trap laws, which are targeted regulations of abortion providers. Waiting periods that are different from state to state, parental consent and notification, Title X restrictions, they've made it very difficult. And then, anti-abortion activists now just want it to be illegal at every stage and under all circumstances. And many of them want to restrict the common forms of birth control that many women use, like the IUD and emergency contraception. They consider they define those as abortion. So let's see. So I think Dr. Parker's story is one of evolution, thoughtful, careful, prayerful, gradual change in his attitudes. I have found his story challenging and deserving of admiration. And I think we might all find a bit of ourselves in his story too. So he's an OBGYN, educated at University of Iowa Medical School and Harvard. Then he went back to Harvard and got a degree in public health. He's been in practice for many years and around the country in Cincinnati, Hawaii, Chicago, California, Washington, DC, but he really became well known in the reproductive justice world as a doctor who travels to and offers abortion care in states where women have great obstacles to getting that care. And there are other doctors in our country who do that. I think the reason, again, that he became so well known was that he spoke out. He not only did it, but he did it publicly, wrote this book and talked about it. a lot. So he would go to like Mississippi, where there's one clinic in the entire state right now. He would go to Alabama, where there might be 3 or 4 clinics. And he would fly in, work there for a few days, fly out. So we could have an entire session on why abortion care has become so difficult to access in this country, particularly in rural areas or red states. But the short answer is, again, harassment by state legislatures and fear experienced by medical personnel, some of whom have literally lost their lives for this cause. So as we'll discuss in a couple minutes here, he not only took on the mantle of providing abortion care well into his medical career, when he realized he could no longer deny that what he had come to understand and believe, he began to speak about it and became a really strong voice for reproductive justice. So let's talk about his conversion, his evolution from someone who admits he didn't really wrestle with the issue of abortion until well into his medical practice, whose faith taught him that abortion is sinful and not to be discussed in polite company, to someone who believes so strongly in a woman's right to control her body and her destiny that he has made it his life work. So he was born in 1962 in Alabama to a single woman who had 6 children, who worked as a maid in a white dentist's house. His great-grandfather was enslaved, and they believed that he was enslaved by a family named Parker, hence his last name. He does not know his father, and when he was actually given a chance to have his father's identity revealed and meet him when he returned to Alabama for his mother's funeral. And he declined to meet that man. And he just said that man had never been in his life. He had never provided for him in any way. So he didn't have any desire to meet him now. He grew up very poor. His mother had high blood pressure and manic depression. She had a couple of incidents of psychotic breaks when he was a child. Like many poor kids, he suffered from asthma because the house they lived in was near a slag heap from a steel plant. So the air quality was really bad. He was, though, recognized as his mother's good child. He was fragile, but he was really, his health was fragile, but he was very smart and very motivated, and he was treated differently. And he was encouraged by the adults in his life because he was smart, recognized as being smart. He does look back on his childhood fondly and says that they had no objective perception. We had no objective perception of our own poverty. He describes his childhood as essentially a happy one. They didn't really know any better. That's just how life was for them. He had said he had strong love and care and guidance from his mother. Church was an extremely important part of his childhood. He went to Missionary Baptist Church every Sunday. His mother sent him to church, and I think he said that because she must have been at work. She must have had to work on Sundays. He was a junior usher. He was in the choir, and because he was smart, he was even given the responsibility to memorize and recite and even stand before the congregation to summarize the day's lesson. Abortion was not talked about. And of course, this was in the days before Roe when he was a kid, so it wasn't legal. It wasn't a legal medical procedure at that time. But it was happening because it always has. If a teenager became pregnant, she might be forced to stand before the congregation and admit her sin to everyone, while the boy who participated in making her pregnant sat in the pews. He says that even as a kid, that pricked his conscience. And he remembers thinking to himself, well, that girl didn't get pregnant by herself. But of course, he was a child. He wasn't able at that point to take that thought any further. He had a baseball coach named Mike Moore, who was a very prominent person in his life, was very religious, and he convinced Willie Parker to become born again when he was 15 years old. At that point, he began carrying Bibles everywhere and going door to door with Mike, attending Bible study. It just was a really big part of his life. And he says then Here's a quote from the book. I don't know how to put this. Let me see. There we go. God is love, and God does not judge, but God's people can become overly pious and haughty, and they can become inflexible. And that's what happened to me. His own sister, Ernestine, who was 3 or 4 years younger than him, became pregnant as a teenager. I believe he was a senior in high school when that happened. And although she didn't want to be pregnant, there was no money for an abortion. And he says he was a senior and he was very busy being important at that time. So he punished her by not speaking to her for months, the entirety of her pregnancy. He wouldn't even look at her. He says, biblical literalism made me self-righteous with regard to sexual purity. I could control myself. Why couldn't she? Ernestine was ostracized by the church, by her friends, by the community. The parents of her friends wouldn't allow their girls to hang out with her anymore. She quit even going to church because of the judgment. And he says his lack of understanding and help to her pain him even to this day. You all can see this, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So he says, now I see the Bible as it's written, the inspired word of God, but also an historical document preserving the ancient hegemony of men. Starting with Eve, women are always thrown under the bus when it suits the men in power to do so. But the way I understood Christianity as a young person was literalistic, strictly black and white. The churches I was raised in were patriarchal. The father was the head of the family, just as Jesus was head of the church. So he left home and went to Berea College in Kentucky. He spent a lot of time evangelizing in his dorm. I'm trying to figure out how to stop sharing here.
Just how to
Oh,
stop
here,
sharing. There you
Okay,
go.
yeah, because I want to see you all. And I'll try to go back and forth between my slides and your faces. So he spent a lot of time in evangelizing, knocking on dorm room doors with his Bible. He says that at that time, the terms pro-life and pro-choice were just sort of emerging. This was about 1980. As a freshman, he was not questioning his rigid Christianity or ideas of right and wrong, or those of his friends and mentors at school. He never considered abortion from a woman's point of view. He even wrote a paper about abortion in a freshman class that was suggested by his professor, who was a retired Catholic priest. He described in that paper abortion as being a life-ending process. But he says he didn't really even think about it. He just wrote it. He was very insulated, of course, at that school, and didn't really understand or hear much about Roe, the Roe v. Wade decision. He did not understand the effect that Roe had on public health and on the doctors who worked in women's health and family planning and cared about the freedom and possibilities that legal abortion promised women. Many of those doctors saw abortion and easy access to other family planning services as a path out of poverty. When he went to medical school then at University of Iowa, that's where he observed an abortion for the first time. And he began to see, because he was required to take the medical histories of women, he began to see that these women were like me. They were choosing to pursue their educations over parenthood, and their decisions resonated with me. They made sense. The moral absolutes I learned in church eroded further. But the next several years, of course, offered him the protection of not finding it necessary to adjust his attitudes or to really think about it in any depth. He didn't learn how to do abortions, and could not do them because he had not been trained. He did his residency in Cincinnati at a hospital that did not offer abortion care. And the first bombings, interesting that the first bombings of an abortion clinic were there in Cincinnati in 1978, and then again in 1985. And he feels like the hospital administration just didn't want to deal with it. So he had no exposure to it there either. He went from there to Merced, California, and he worked in a community health center there to a medically underserved population, lots of migrant workers. There were no abortion providers there for 50 miles, so they always referred them out. If a woman came in and wanted that service, they had to refer them out. And again, he keeps having all these things happen that are sort of protecting him from having to face what was going on. Let's see, I'm going to share the screen again. Well, every time I have to go do, let's see. For almost the entire time I was a practicing OBGYN there, he meant California, I had the luxury of holding on to my unexamined Christian morals, uncontested by circumstance. I could tell myself I was doing good work, helping poor women deliver healthy babies and providing birth control to teenagers and working against domestic violence. But on the question of abortion, I could continue to absolve myself of having to take responsibility for my own inaction, pointing to the authorities or circumstances or laws that barred me from doing battle with myself. I was not pro-life. I believed in a woman's right to choose, but I was complicit with anti-abortion forces in that I did not place myself on the front lines. So his career and personal evolution continued when he went from there to Hawaii, and where abortion care was offered in the hospital where he was working and had been for a long time. He still wasn't performing abortions, but he was at a hospital that was. But they got, in 2002, they got a new chief administrator at that hospital who said, we're not doing abortions anymore. He blamed it on the fact that he said if they did them, they would lose Title X money, which is, Title X money is federal dollars that go for family planning, excluding abortion. Places like Planned Parenthood, who take Title X money, which they don't even take anymore because there are so many roadblocks. But at the time, if an abortion clinic took Title X money for family planning and they did abortions, they had to basically have two sets of books to show that every penny of Title X money went to family planning, not one penny. If even one penny went to abortion, you'd lose your Title X money. And when I served on that board in Dallas, it was a constant and expensive thing to keep track of. And the anti-choice people did come in and look at the books with regularity. Let's see. So basically, this chief administrator told them they weren't going to do abortion anymore because they would lose their Title X money, which wasn't true. And so this was the event that finally, I think, got him the straw that broke the camel's back, so to speak. He describes that event and the actions taken then by the residents, female residents, medical residents he was supervising, as the ones that forced him to examine the situation closely. He always thought the battle was out there. He didn't have to deal with it. But this decision by this chief administrator infuriated him. He believed the services offered should be based on needs of patients and not the religious beliefs of the doctors. And this man was an evangelical Christian. So women had been provided abortion care at this hospital for 30 years without question, and all of a sudden it was gone. So the six female residents he was supervising at the time banded together because they were so angry and upset about this, and went to another hospital in Honolulu and began a practice there where they provided abortion care to people. And he was so in awe of these women who just said, we're not going to take this anymore. We're going to do something about it. So let's see, I'm going to go back to my screen share because the terms of the abortion battle were really changing at this time. Let's see. States were chipping away. Oh, I might have taken that slide out. States were chipping away at abortion rights. Fetuses had rights. Women were treated as criminals or mentally incompetent, and therefore not in possession of any rights at all. So he talks about his awe for these women who took the situation and did something about it. And he said he could no longer deny his ethical engagement. He had deferred his decision for too long. He had refused to perform abortions out of loyalty to his Christian identity. But I had evolved a great deal since my Christian conversion, and other identities had long since grown up beside it. He said, I learned a black and white faith, but I am not a black and white person. Let's see. These quotes I found very interesting. Instead of focusing their efforts on overturning Roe, the antis, and he refers to them as the antis, began stealthily chipping away at abortion access on the state and local level, arguing that fetuses had rights equal to kindergartners learning to tie their shoes. Overnight, it seemed, the antis had masterfully changed the terms of the debate, turning the vitriol of previous decades into something like civic righteousness. And then down below that, it was not lost on me, an African-American man from Birmingham, Alabama, descended from slaves, that new legislation aimed at telling women what they might and might not do with their own physical bodies looked a lot like men owning women's bodies. He says here, basically, of the situation in Hawaii, I could no longer defer my ethical engagement. I felt our patients were entitled to abortions if they wanted them, and they had been receiving abortion care without controversy or comment for 30 years. To me, it wasn't acceptable to deny them a safe and legal procedure. It wasn't right. So he had long listened to the audio recordings of Wendell Berry, Thomas Merton, C.S. Lewis, Martin Luther King Jr. He describes Martin Luther King Jr. as his personal saint, and King's book, Strength to Love, very important to him. And this is a quote from that book, which meant a lot to him. Science gives man knowledge, which is power. Religion gives man wisdom, which is control. The two are not enemies. It was these words of King that persuaded Willie Parker that his two great interests, science and religion, did not conflict. And then he says science began to chip away even further at the absolutist claims of his faith. He listened. He says he's listened to Martin Luther King's sermon, I've been to the mountaintop, hundreds of times. But now, after this event in Hawaii, after these brave female residents found a way to continue offering the abortion care they believed women deserve, he heard it with new ears. And so he particularly pulled out this quote from that sermon: for when people get caught up with that which is right and they are willing to sacrifice for it, there's no stopping point short of victory. He also heard the story of the Good Samaritan, which we all know so well. He heard it with new ears now. The man lying in the road, wounded, maybe dead. Two men, the priest and the Levite, bypass him, leaving the man lying in the road. The Good Samaritan stops, administers first aid, help the man in need. And of course, we know Jesus said that only the Good Samaritan was great. And Dr. King speculates, and I'm paraphrasing here, maybe the men were busy and late for a church meeting, and maybe they were following a religious edict requiring priests and Levites not to contaminate themselves by touching another human body in advance of a religious ritual. Maybe they joined a committee to study safety of travelers and felt it was better to deal with the problem from that angle. It's possible they were afraid. Maybe they were worrying most of all about their own skin and didn't want to risk injury to themselves by stopping. It's possible they felt that the man on the ground was faking and part of a scheme to lure soft-hearted tourists into an ambush. They passed the man by because their first thought was for themselves. What if I stop to help this man, what will happen to me, in other words? And Martin Luther King Jr. says what made the Good Samaritan good was that he reversed that question. If I do not stop to help this man, what will happen to him? So Willie Parker says on this particular day, that was a punch in his spiritual gut. And I love that imagery. And I bet we've all maybe had a punch in the spiritual gut sometimes. The Spirit came alive and spoke to him. And he says, quote from his book, "For the Samaritan, the person in need was a fallen traveler. For me, it was a pregnant woman." So he turned the question on its head and read it this way: it's not, is it right for me as a Christian to perform abortions? Rather, is it right for me as a Christian to refuse to do them? So he realized that he'd been afraid, and he was afraid of tarnishing his reputation, and he was resting too much on his cushy fact that he spoke out about domestic violence and sexual assault, but wasn't taking a stance on abortion at all. So he says at that time he decided it would be inappropriate and even cowardly for me to be contented to sit by as other people did this work. From that moment on, not providing abortions and not living out my convictions would have been a fate worse than death. So he, at that point, went to his mentor who worked at this hospital and said, "Teach me, train me, I'm going to do this." He writes a lot about the women he treats. I found that to be extremely interesting and educational. Of course, we've heard these statistics: 1 in 3 women have had an abortion in their lives. Some large proportion of those women have been raised in churches where they've heard negative messages about this. And their church, their neighborhood, the people they know officially disapprove of that, would officially disapprove of that decision. Hence, people keep it to themselves the majority of the time. He says, as a Christian, I feel it's my job to help offer a counter narrative that God gave every woman gifts and the agency to realize those gifts, and nothing about choosing to terminate a pregnancy or to delay childbearing puts a woman outside God's love. When he answers women's questions, when he meets with them in clinics and they are worried and sometimes very, very sure about their decision, and yet worried about how they will be perceived and where they will be with God, that he thinks to himself, no God I believe in would judge this woman for wanting to be the best version of herself. He writes about the price of poverty, that onerous burden of poverty, and I don't mean just, he didn't mean just lack of food and money and housing and access to sex ed or birth control. He talks about how people living in poverty are treated as second-class citizens. Being poor threatens a person's sense of self-determination in her dreams. And he tells a little story about a grandmother figure who was on her deathbed back in Alabama, and he flew in to visit with her before she passed. And she said to him, Lord, 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 I wish people could see you now, Willie James. So many people said you were never going to be nothing. And this was a smart kid. And he said he was so struck by that because he was raised, given opportunities, and raised with this notion of his intelligence. And yet people wrote him off because he was poor. So they didn't ever think that he would be anything. This realization, he says, makes him better able to relate to his patients, women who come to him for abortions, choosing a path different from what others would script for them. So we touched on this a little bit. I want to return to the 1980s and what happened in this country when the evangelicals, the antis, as he calls them, took over the conversation. Until the 1980s, abortion was seen by many, and especially, he says, in conservative Southern churches and society, churches in particular, it was a political, legislative issue. It was not a religious issue at that point. Devout people were to immerse themselves in the Bible and God, not politics. Leave politics to the heathens was the way that was looked at that time. But in the 1980s, the anti-choice movement really took off. They took control of that term, pro-life, and they took the moral high ground. And we all know about Jerry Falwell, who was always yelling about abortion is murder, and the focus on the family, and let's see, I lost my place. Family values, sanctity of life, Pro-choice people didn't and still haven't, he says, offered a moral, a spiritual, an ethical, or a religious case for abortion rights. And he wishes we would. He says we ceded those arguments to our opponents. We let them have it. Dr. Parker states the tactics used by the antis were explicitly unchristian. They believe scripture's on their side, but in actuality, the word abortion isn't in the Bible. We all know that. He acknowledges the Bible as an inspired document. It's full of guidance about justice and love, but he also calls attention to the fact that we all know that as an historical document, the Bible contains misogyny. Women were property to be bought and sold. Menstruation was seen as defiling and contaminating, and women were separated when they were on their periods, and then they had to go through these rituals of purification before they could rejoin society. There were very strict rules about when women could have sex, which was never, unless it was with her husband, who, by the way, might have multiple wives. So, in adultery, if you were accused of adultery, which if your husband got tired of you, he could say that you had no rights, you would probably be stoned to death. Starting with Adam and Eve, women were cast in the role of temptress and men as having no responsibility. So he spends several pages in the book explaining the biological developments that take place after the sperm meets the egg and issues related to viability. I don't want us to spend a bunch of time talking about that now, but I think it's really interesting to read all that. He's incensed that the antis use the term baby throughout pregnancy when it's not a proper medical term. Doctors don't call it a baby, they call it a fetus. Using the term baby, he says, of course, they glommed onto that and used it because they want it to be an emotional experience. And he also says that before sonograms, people couldn't see. He describes the uterus as a black box. People couldn't see what was in there. But now with sonograms, people can see what's developing inside a woman's body. That is a wonderful thing if you are parents who are desperate to have a child, a wanted child. But he says the antis have used it, of course, to their advantage, showing the posters, and maybe you've all seen or been to protests where they're holding up posters of pretty much a full-term baby, and insinuating, claiming that that's what's happening, which is not true. The other thing that they have, I wanted to bring this slide back up because the other thing, where is it? The other thing that the antis have done, okay, I skipped right by that one. They've used this verse from Jeremiah: before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I set you apart. So, of course, the anti-choice movement has claimed that as proof that the Bible says abortion is wrong. We also had during that time Ronald Reagan, who was a staunch anti-choice person, and a quote, and I remember him saying this at the time and being outraged, quote, human life legislation ending this tragedy, meaning abortion, will someday pass the Congress, and you and I must never rest until it does. So Willie Parker says, even in my most fundamentalist moments, there was no Christianity I recognized as, this was no Christianity that I recognized as mine, starting with the fact that nearly every mother I knew was a single mother, including, and most important, my own, which argued for a broader definition of family values. More, the God I learned about was one of hope and transcendence, of pure joy. My God was ambitious for me. I knew for sure he didn't care if I was poor or Black or born into hardship. He didn't want me to be anything other than what I was, and he wanted to love me so that I would thrive and prosper, both materially and spiritually. He continued, hey, Marianne, I'm aware that we are bumping up on our time. Let's see, I'm going to skip a little bit. I don't want to miss, let's see. He says that he began to realize, he began to just ask himself a lot of important questions, which maybe some of you have asked yourselves. How might I believe that God created the world when I love biology and I knew about evolution? How might I hold the Bible's version of male dominance over women when my mother raised me better than any man? How might I square my church's repugnance for premarital sex with the fact that many good people I knew were having sex with regularity? How might I think about slavery and justice and the very punitive terms the Bible sets for the faithful that violate God's rules? And how might I think about hell? He says, I began to understand I had to find a thinking person's religion or abandon God altogether. The Christianity that he learned as a child began to seem shallow and emotional and naive to him. So he asked himself, how might I reconcile my ability to think critically? How might I reconcile my ability to think critically required as I pursued my path to becoming a medical doctor, and at the same time continue to see myself as a person of deep faith? So he says, many seem to accept without thinking that to be a Christian is to oppose abortion rights. In my view, the only Christianity that mandates an anti-abortion view is an emotion-based faith, a rigid reading of scripture that invites no questioning or interpretive consideration. The Bible is not stuck in time, but rather a living, breathing, divinely inspired document. And the God that I believe exists within its pages is big enough and flexible enough and loving enough to accommodate a very different perspective. More, my God is a radical God who requires us to love one another because of our own sinfulness and to be generous with one another, even when our impulses want to lead us back to the safety of those childish, narrow beliefs that make us afraid to act. So he says that his professional circumstances forced him out of his complacency, basically, finally, to articulate a new understanding of God. He says talking about abortion should be something that happens in churches and not suppressed by religious authorities in the interest of preserving their own power. Women should find healing and understanding in church, not stigma and shame. He thinks a lot about the vastness of God and the belief that if you cannot get beyond the animate and the personal, so anthropomorphizing God, then you can't get to the goodness and the bigness of that which is other. And I just want to finish with reading you a paragraph from the last page of his book, which I found extremely powerful. He says, if you look at it that way, if you set aside the idea that God is like Siri telling you to go left or go right, then the whole business is sacred. All of it. A pregnancy that intimates a baby is not more sacred than an abortion. You don't become sacred like Mary just because you conceived. And the termination of a pregnancy is not the resolution of an error. It is merely one of the reproductive outcomes. And so is miscarriage. So now is surrogacy and in vitro fertilization. All these are on a continuum and they all hold moral weight. The God part is in your agency, the trust, the divine trust, that you have an opportunity to participate in the population of the planet, and you have an opportunity not to participate. Is God vested one way or another in whether you as an individual become pregnant? No. Is a pregnancy sacred because there will be a baby ultimately in a bassinet? Beautiful. Maybe the next Obama. No. The process is bigger than you are. The part of you that's like God is the part that makes a choice, that says, I choose to, or I choose not to. That's what's sacred. That's the part of you that's like God to me. So that concludes my comments. And Marianne, I don't know if you want to give everybody a minute to ask a question or make a comment. I'm sorry I filled up so much time. I timed myself yesterday and it was only 42 minutes. So obviously I talked slower or something today.
Well, I know that we are 2 minutes over the time. We have maybe time for one or two comments before Cece has to move on to the next meeting. And this is a lot to assimilate in a short amount of time. I certainly understand that. Yes,
Yeah.
Cece.
Okay. I don't know how many people have read that book, but I did. And I would suggest that everybody read that book. I mean, Diane gave us a very good overview, but it changed a lot of the ideas and opinions that I held. And it's a powerful book. That's all I could say.
Thank
Bill?
you, Diane, for doing it.
Bill, I saw you and then Juanita.
You touched upon it, but how do you deal with the difficult issue of late-term abortions
Oh,
when the fetus is definitely viable and a living thing?
he doesn't write about that a lot in his book, but he does at one point touch on it by saying late-term abortion is not something that a woman just walks in and does. It's again, the aunties have taken that narrative to make it sound like people are routinely terminating pregnancies, after viability. That really doesn't happen. The only time that happens, and this is what we call late-term abortion, is when the fetus has been found to have a serious birth defect, not compatible with life, or the mother's health has become endangered. That's when that procedure is used.
It's extraordinarily rare.
Very, 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 very rare. Very rare.
I remember my daughter-in-law, who's a pediatrician at a children's hospital, said late-term abortion usually is called delivery.
Yeah.
I mean, it's the delivery of, it's not with the idea that that fetus is not going to make it. I mean, unless it's by a natural circumstance. Yeah, Juanita, did you have a question? Comment?
Yes, I did. I just had more of a comment. Thank you so much, Diane, for that. I have years of experience in terms of working as a nurse and first as a counselor in New York City, where it was legal to have abortions before the other states. So as a counselor, we had a clinic where women would fly in from all over and their experiences, and then worked here in Santa Fe for 6 years at the Women's Health Center with Dr. Zeiss, and had the experience to work there. And we had wonderful women who had a group for those women who couldn't afford to pay for abortions. Abortions were covered without any questions by these incredible women in Santa Fe. So the experiences and the life history is huge. So thank you for giving us a portion of that.
Yeah. Well, and thank you for your good work you've done.
Yes, thank
Okay.
you. Cece,
Okay.
we have to
Yeah,
go.
just one real quick statement in response to what Bill asked Diane. And you read the book, Willie Parker does not perform any abortion past week 23.
Yeah, that's true.
He says that many, many times through there.
He sees that as like a specialized care in specialized circumstances.
Right. Okay.
Okay.
Thank
Thanks everybody for coming to the class.
Diane.
I want to
Have a
thank
good day.
Diane for doing it.
You're welcome.
Okay.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Yeah.